matters. It's in partnership with the Scottish Nature Finance Pioneers and the Natural Environment Research Council funded programme Integrating Finance and Biodiversity. I'll put all the links to all those organisations in the chat if you want to sign up to any of those newsletters and so on. Just follow those web links. We're likely to be a good number of us today, so Julia's going to keep us all on mute until the Q&A section. But if you find you have questions as our speakers are going through their presentations, do put them in the Q&A section of Teams. You should notice the Q&A in your toolbar of Teams. We are recording the presentations for colleagues who can't make it right now so that they can catch up on demand. We won't record the Q&A section, so you can feel free to speak frankly in that section. So back to Julia to introduce the topic.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today. So I just wanted to cover a couple, I just wanted to take a couple minutes to highlight some context for today's discussion. So here you'll see there are a few different drivers for offsets, and the focus today is on offsets within the compliance and regulatory context. So the term offset can mean different things across voluntary and compliance spaces. So here on the slide is a definition of offsets from the Business and Biodiversity Offset Program. Effectively, offsets represent the outcomes that are intended to compensate for biodiversity loss associated with often development-related impacts to the environment. So today, our speakers will use different terms to describe compensation and enhancement benefit frameworks across three distinct policy contexts. So compensatory mitigation for permanent impacts to aquatic resources under the Clean Water Act in the US, net benefit for biodiversity under the Planning Policy Framework for Wales, and biodiversity enhancement under the National Planning Framework in Scotland. So while the approaches differ across these contexts, you'll hear everyone today highlight how the mitigation hierarchy is key, and compensatory mitigation, net benefit, or enhancement only occur following an evaluation of impacts and demonstrated efforts to avoid and minimize loss. So the other bit I wanted to briefly touch on is the term offsite, because this can also mean many things. So apologies for my very basic sketch on this slide. But offsite can just simply mean compensation is provided by the same project developer adjacent to a red line project boundary, or that it's consolidated sites that are provided by a third party like banks or fee-supported projects. So there's a lot to unpack when looking at offsite options. When is it appropriate? How do you ensure impacts and offsets are comparable, and that offsite options are meaningful, appropriate, and strategic? So today we're going to dive into this a bit more to hear about how compensation can work best for nature in the local context. So first up, we have Steve Martin to talk about compensatory mitigation under the Clean Water Act in the US. So this regulatory program addresses dredge and fill related impacts to ecosystem functions within aquatic ecosystems. So in the US, wetlands are defined by regulation based on hydrology, hydric soils, and vegetation characteristics. And just for context, for a lot of people who are joining from the UK here, many ecosystems in the UK could probably be classified as wetlands. For example, habitats like wet woodlands or grasslands, peatlands, alder, willow cars, marshes, bogs, and other groundwater-dependent ecosystems. So anyway, Steve has 30 years of experience with compensatory mitigation, mitigation policy, and evaluation mitigation projects within the federal government, nonprofit, and the private sector. He's retired from the Corps' Institute for Water Resources as a mitigation specialist, and there he helped provide technical support to develop the Corps EPA 2008 compensatory mitigation rule, which you'll hear more about in his presentation. So without further ado, I'll turn it to Steve.
Thanks very much, Julia. Could I have the next slide? Next slide, please.
Yep, there you go.
Okay. So in the US, under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, there is a general policy for compensatory mitigation. Mitigation has to be for significant resource loss, and it has to be directly related to the impacts of the proposal. And we use as a shorthand the word mitigation, dropping compensation. we presume that prerequisite avoidance and minimization of impacts has taken place before considering any kind of compensatory mitigation, any mitigation. Next slide, please. So mitigation is required by regs to ensure that the permitted activity isn't contrary to the public interest, and to ensure that impacts to the human environment associated with a permitted action are not significant. In other words, mitigation is used to balance or reduce or ameliorate those impacts, and contributes to a national goal that's been in place since 1989 of no net loss of wetlands. Next slide. Compensatory mitigation has been implemented in the states under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act for greater than 50 years. Originally, on-site compensation was preferred, and by on-site, it was meant either abutting permitted impact or adjacent to a permitted impact. And the presumption was that on-site mitigation was more likely to offset those permitted losses than off-site compensation. And this approach was formally emphasized as a preference in a memorandum of agreement between these two agencies in 1990 and applied nationwide. Next slide, please. Wetlands and streams provide a host of functions and related services. The idea is to first consider the potential loss of functions or services associated with a permitted impact, and then seek projects that have a higher degree of likelihood of replacing those. Here are some potential projects, some potential services provided by mitigation projects. Obviously, no single project can provide all of these functions or services. Next slide. Compensatory mitigation and its success or performance had been evaluated in states, particularly from 1992 to 2006, starting with Florida and then expanding to include California, Massachusetts, Minnesota, New Hampshire, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, and other states. And all of them identified similar problems. A failure to implement these projects that were authorized by permits anywhere between 20 to 35% of the time. Typically, the permittees may not have implemented or fully implemented the project, at least according to the permit, because of the lack of regulatory oversight. There was a prevalence of on-site wetland creation, and this actually contributed to a low rate of ecological success. Instead of implementing a project that would actually offset the lost functions, because of the preference for on-site, you often saw created or constructed wetlands that were very different from the resources that had been impacted. For instance, wet impoundments to offset seasonally saturated forested wetlands. Basically, it comes down to a failure to understand wetland systems and aquatic resources, particularly hydrologic drivers and ground elevations. In 2000, the Corps of Engineers and EPA contracted with the National Research Council to evaluate compensatory mitigation to date and make recommendations for improving compensation. They looked at compensation across the country. They came up with more than 24 recommendations for improving compensation. Key for this session is the focus on site selection. They had indicated that site selection needed to be done on a watershed scale, and we needed to move away from an on-site preference. Next slide, please. They also recommended operational guidelines for improving compensation, recognizing that natural systems are naturally variable or dynamic, and that should be incorporated into our projects, focusing on restoration where possible over creation and avoiding over-engineering. Next slide. In 2004, Congress directed the Corps of Engineers and EPA to develop mitigation regulations that covered compensatory mitigation for impacts to aquatic resources. The regs were to address standards and requirements, where and how mitigation was to be done, and to govern all forms of mitigation. That's mitigation banks, in lieu fee programs, and permittee responsible or project-specific mitigation. And all forms of mitigation were to be held to equivalent standards. We incorporated basically 24 of the NRC's recommendations in this 2008 rule. Some of those incorporations are expressed as preferences. So restoration, that is rehabilitation or reestablishment of aquatic resources, was preferred over other forms of mitigation. Number one, because it's more likely to be successful. Number two, more likely to offset permitted losses. In-kind compensation, by which we mean in similar landscape position and of a similar hydrologic regime, was preferred, again, because it's more likely to offset lost functions and services associated with the impact site. It also developed a mitigation hierarchy. The idea that offsite mitigation would generally be preferred because it tended to be thought out in advance of the project. Mitigation banks are consolidated compensation. They have a defined geographic area that they provide compensation, and any kind of credit is released only upon meeting specific milestones, performance standards. In lieu fee programs utilize a watershed-based approach to compensatory mitigation, to site selection, and so they're generally preferred. Go ahead, next slide is fine. One mechanism for ensuring equivalency between these different types of mitigation was the idea of a mitigation plan, and that all mitigation plans, regardless of the type of compensation, had to have and incorporate these 12 elements. And we'll focus on site selection. This idea of site selection was solidified in the idea of utilizing a watershed or landscape level approach to compensation. Next slide, please. This watershed approach is simply a strategic approach to site selection, one that considers the impairments, the needs, the history within that landscape area to better identify what projects are necessary to address those impairments or address those needs. And it considers these kinds of elements. Next slide, please. Service area is a key component of offsite compensation. It's the watershed, ecoregion, or province, or other geographic area. It's the boundary within which a bank or an in lieu fee program can provide compensation. And it may be defined administratively in terms of counties or groups of counties within a state. It may be defined according to hydrology, by watershed or bay, or it may even be habitat-based. For instance, habitat for an at-risk species, in this case, the giant garter snake of Central California. Next slide. Some of the best examples of a watershed approach are with in lieu fee programs. All are required under regulation to have compensation planning frameworks. And that framework addresses each specific service area within the in lieu fee program. This is the state of Maine. It has a statewide in lieu fee program. Each of those different colored polygons are service areas, and each has its own compensation planning framework. These are the components that are in that framework, and they're used to help guide site selection. Next slide, please. Compensation planning frameworks can also utilize existing planning resources. What you're seeing depicted here in the black are specific service areas for a statewide in lieu fee program administered by the Nature Conservancy for the state of Ohio. It incorporates a lot of planning resources, documents that were developed prior to the initiation of the in lieu fee programs. Often they were developed for different purposes under different mandates, but the compensation planning framework brings them together to identify resource needs and potential projects in each of those service areas. Next slide. Okay, so for more information, here are a number of references that you might want to consider for more information about mitigation in the states. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thanks. Sorry, Julia, you're doing the handover.
Yep, no, that's all good. Thank you so much, Steve. As you can see, Steve tried to cover a lot of ground and a lot of history in a very short amount of time. So we will share the slides later for those people that, kind of want to look at more of the details within there as well. So now we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about the net benefit for biodiversity approach being developed in Wales. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve Spode and Siobhan Wiltshire. So Steve is the head of ecosystem management in Welsh Government, where he leads on ecosystem and ecological policy and advice. He's an ecologist and landscape architect with many years of experience working in biodiversity conservation, environmental assessment, ecological management, and restoration. And Siobhan is a planner working in the planning policy team of Welsh Government. The team are responsible for planning policy Wales and Wales's National Development Plan Future Wales.
Thanks, Julia. I'll kick off first and then I'll hand over to Steve who'll finish off our little section. So next slide, please. I'm going to talk you through our policy as presented in our Planning Policy Wales document. This is our national policy document. It's the document that's in the middle of the top line of documents highlighted on this slide here. So there's a lot to talk about in terms of policy, but I'm going to really drill down and focus on the net benefit element of the policy. So we've defined a net benefit for biodiversity as the concept that development should leave biodiversity and the resilience of ecosystems in a significantly better state than before through securing immediate and long-term measurable and demonstrable benefit, primarily or preferably immediately adjacent to the site. So our approach is driven by legislation, and that's the Environment Act of 2016. It's a qualitative approach. We do not have a metric element in Wales, and it's deeply embedded in our placemaking approach. It's about understanding a site in context and the functional ecological relationships in and around that site. It's proactive, creative, and outcome focused. We as government consider that our local authorities know their patches best, and they intrinsically understand how best to secure the right outcomes in the right places within their areas. And our policy provides opportunities for collaborative arrangements between local authorities, and this is a new policy hook that we introduced in 2024, and Steve will talk a little bit more about this. So Planning Policy Wales reflects the legislative context, and for planning we've defined that as the fact that we need to move away from a culture of impact and mitigate to one where we carefully weave in development alongside nature. So our policy is therefore constructed on two pillars. So we have a framework, which is outlined here on the right of the slide, and we have the approach, which is our stepwise policy. So the stepwise approach, as presented in this summary diagram, is a 6-step process for decision makers, and it sets out a logical and pragmatic progression through a series of policy considerations. The policy itself is built around the need to, the overriding need to avoid damage to biodiversity and ecosystem resilience in the first place. And it works through steps familiar to all of those here, working with the mitigation hierarchy. and it all is focused around the aim of avoiding and minimising damage to biodiversity and ecosystem resilience. We've made it explicit in our updated policy that enhancements should be secured at each and every step of the process, and that these measures must be secured with a long-term management plan. So in doing so, in working through the steps, providing enhancements, securing it with a long-term management plan, a net benefit for biodiversity will be secured. To support this policy, we use what we call, just to go back to that slide, Julia, sorry, we use the DECA framework. So this is a framework that was developed by our statutory nature conservation advisor, and it's an approach that guides us through considering ecosystem resilience. So we've used the 5 attributes of resilience that were identified in the Environment Act, and then this framework enables us to consider the state of ecosystem resilience on site, and it can be used at different scales and for different habitat types. Just a few more details then on the next slide of the net benefit policy. So as I said, there's a strong avoidance focus. We've excluded designated sites from site searches. We've introduced a new definition of irreplaceable habitat. We're always looking to avoid damage to biodiversity and ecosystems. And we want to maintain the largest functional area of connected habitats and existing features. And as I said just a moment ago, we've got this new step where we require a long-term management plan. To support this policy, we've also identified 3 principles within our policy framework, and those are highlighted here on the screen. So we're looking to establish the baseline state of biodiversity and ecosystem resilience on site. We've said that all developments, regardless of scale, must deliver a net benefit for biodiversity. And we've introduced a new policy around preemptive site clearance works. So, some people within our group call that bramble clearance. Some have more cynical terms for it, but we've put a policy hook in there. So we're trying to avoid preemptive site clearance works taking place. On the next slide, I've set out the detail of our step 4, which is the offsite compensation step. There's an awful lot of text on there. That's the full policy, and you'll be able to read it, more closely later on when you have the slides. But I've just tried to pull out from the policy some of the key features. So offsite compensation is to be considered as a last resort, and it must be of a significant magnitude to fully compensate for any loss. And then in providing offsite compensation, we've set out what we want an applicant or a developer to provide. So the compensation should normally take the form of habitat restoration or creation. We want it to be guided by existing frameworks that local authorities have within their green infrastructure assessments. So it's a planned approach. For species, we've said that where we're compensating for specific species, the focus should be on maintaining and enhancing the population of that species within its natural range. And we've also set out in policy that any proposed compensation should be place-based, take account of our legislation, our Section 6 duty, and it should be informed by appropriate ecological advice. I'll now hand over to Steve, who'll talk you through some of our thinking around offsite compensation.
Hi, apologies, no camera. My brand new laptop's decided not to work in terms of the camera, so you have to do it at my beautiful face. Right, just picking up and amplifying some of the things that Siobhan's raised here. I think the main thing here is that only after development has exhausted all of the steps of the stepwise approach should offsite compensation normally be considered. And yeah, offsite compensation sometimes is the only way sometimes of actually delivering a complete net benefit for biodiversity, only after you've worked through all of the steps in the stepwise approach. So it's not, there's always a worry that people tend to go straight for offsite compensation, and they have to sort of firstly see how they've avoided an impact and minimized it, and then provided mitigation and restoration on site. And also, if they're going to be doing compensation, that compensation should happen ideally on site or as close to it as possible. But as Steve was saying earlier on, there are some occasions where you can't fully do that. So offsite compensation is in the mix here, but we don't want people to go straight for that. And in practice, delivering an benefit for biodiversity is about delivering a sort of suite of actions across the restoration hierarchy, which we also use. I imagine that would be quite a common theme today. The advantages of offsite compensation are mainly linked around the kind of the strategic opportunities that it can provide. Firstly, if linked to spatial priorities of perhaps governments or NGOs, for example, resident ecological networks or ecological networks, carefully placed offsite compensation can contribute to sort of more strategic actions to join up biodiversity at the landscape scale. In a similar way, one of our key priorities for our protected site networks is to make them bigger, better, and more joined up. So again, carefully placed resourcing around those to help do that, is an advantage. So if sites can be found to deliver those strategic actions, then offsite compensation can be directed towards those areas. In doing so, those things can also contribute towards our global UK and Welsh targets, particularly the Global Biodiversity Framework 30 by 30 target, where we have to effectively manage 30% of our land, sea, and fresh water, and also particularly delivering towards the restoration target. So there's a great opportunity to do that. So it can be a tool for delivering our sort of priorities here in Wales. It also can allow for collaboration, particularly with the local authorities, working together to identify strategic sites in the way developers develop strategic sites for developing. Then local authorities and others can develop strategic sites for nature recovery. So the approach allows people from different local authorities to plan these areas, and also to take resources for perhaps a number of development sites to actually provide compensation at scale. And talking about scale, we have obviously the economies of scale here. If you're putting the proceeds of development into a big box of actions you can do in one place, then that's going to be easier to deliver, easier to monitor, and easier to enforce. So offsite compensation does come with some quite big strategic advantages, but it is in Planning Policy Wales, it is a last resort, and only after you've gone through all of the other steps. I think the appropriateness of offsite compensation will very much depend on the quality and extent of the ecological features being compensated for, and I think that's a big issue in this area, because Planning Policy Wales is very clear that protected sites and irreplaceable habitats must be avoided. So I think there's the idea you can recreate those is very, very difficult, well, impossible actually, because the irreplaceable habitat label just tells you that, doesn't it? So it has limitations. You can't just go everywhere. The avoidance issue is key here. If you've got a protected site and irreplaceable habitats, you really need to find another site to do your development on. I think it also depends on the treatment of the ecological features on the development site itself, because I think if you're not looking at the opportunities to avoid and minimize on site, and also to sort of compensate and mitigate on site, then you're not going to be doing the right thing. I mean, lots of the idea of a scorch earth approach is just not appropriate, and that's where I think
Steve,
some are
that's
heading
13 minutes.
Okay, thank you. And just rounding off now. So the issues and problems with offsite compensation is, as I just said, the ability to recreate the ecological features on a new site. Yeah, it can be a difficulty. Some habitats are replaceable, others are challenging and can take a long time. And yeah, if it takes a long time, lots can go wrong in that time. Also, the proximity of the compensation site to the one being lost is also really important in terms of species. You've got a protected species population on that site. You can't just go and put it somewhere else. You know, it is embedded into that ecosystem. You can't just shift it. Also, by impacting those habitats, you're impacting on the resilience of the ecosystems on the site itself, which means that you will lose the ecosystem services on that site, which can range from flood risk management and climate adaptation, moderation services to cultural, recreational, health benefits for people, which brings us on to the issue of social justice. If you're losing the kind of ecosystems and ecosystem services from a site, then that population around that site will not be able to benefit from those things, which is important. And finally, although there are many other issues, I think it's the actual difficulty of land assembly, finding the right areas of land in the right place, and willing landowners prepared to sort of pass them over for this purpose is also going to be a challenge. So in conclusion, offsite compensation needs to be considered alongside other actions in the mitigation hierarchy, and it needs to be really carefully planned. And that's it from me, I think. Thank you.
Julia, you're on mute.
There we go. Thank you so much, Siobhan and Steve. That really great information coming out of Wales on your policy and some of the priorities there. Last up on our agenda, we're going to shift gears again to talk about biodiversity enhancement in Scotland. So next up is Johnny Wyatt. He's RSPB Scotland's Biodiversity Enhancement Program Manager, and Johnny oversees all aspects of the organization's advocacy on and operational involvement in biodiversity enhancement. So on to you, Johnny.
Thanks, Julia. Nice to see you all today. I'm joining you from our Forsenard Reserve up in the far northeast. First slide, please. Okay, so many of you will be very familiar with the Scottish context, but for the benefit of those who perhaps aren't so much, my focus at the RSPB has been on biodiversity enhancement, which is the Scottish Net Gain system brought in as Policy 3 under National Planning Framework 4 in early 2023. Basic principle is the same as England's Biodiversity Net Gain and Wales's NBB. The vast majority of new development must leave nature in a better state. But the route to achieving this has been quite different to BNG, and it's really interesting to hear how things have developed in Wales, and quite a lot of the things I'll talk about in future slides sort of come under the same sort of considerations. Biodiversity enhancement is a planning policy requirement. It's not a statutory one like BNG, and that has quite a lot of consequences for the way in which it plays out through the planning system. Initially, there was no metric mandated. There is now a Scottish metric in development. Policy 3 provided a really high-level framework for delivery, using sort of phrases as best practice methods, links to nature networks. Significant biodiversity enhancements should be provided, but left the vast majority of thinking about what biodiversity enhancement delivery actually entails up to each individual planning authority. So what we've got is 32 slightly different approaches, which can cause quite a lot of confusion. There's actually nothing in the original Policy 3 wording about the balance between onsite and offsite. But one of the few things that subsequent ScotGov guidance was definitive on is that developers should prioritise onsite enhancement before offsite delivery, essentially to ensure that areas of land do not become nature poor and maintain access for communities. Steve mentioned social justice, and this is something that I'll come back to later. I guess from the RSPB's perspective, we feel this is a bit of a false trade-off, and that actually done properly, offsite is likely to leave the area around the development much more nature-rich than on-site enhancement. Interesting to see that Wales has adopted as a sort of a last resort position. There's definitely a discussion there for the end. Next slide, please. So the RSPB vision for biodiversity enhancement, in this context, my role was to articulate what that was, what RSPB Scotland considered a best practice approach to biodiversity enhancement, drawing on some of the lessons and pitfalls from BNG in England. And this was work funded by Nature Scots IONS funding. And it perhaps won't surprise you to hear that we feel that to deliver meaningful and sustainable benefits for nature, each biodiversity enhancement must be a contribution to bigger, better, and more joined up ecological networks, to echo Steve's point from just before, focused on priority habitats and species, designed using a site-specific and evidence-based approach. Enhancement should contribute to the delivery of nature networks, as is set out in the Policy 3 language, but we believe that must be sort of spatially expressed locally and regionally to provide this steer for developers. They must also be beneficial to the community, that kind of goes without saying, which will be very context and location specific. So kind of must be ascertained through early and sort of sustained engagement between the developer, the enhancement provider, and local communities. Underpinning all of this, the mitigation hierarchy is paramount. This is the bit above the y-axis in the axis in the graph Julia shared in the intro slides. The mitigation hierarchy maintains that you must compensate to no net loss within the red line boundary. So this ensures no loss of nature locally. It's the enhancement component, so that bit beyond no net loss of the work that we feel should not be constrained to the development site. For BE to achieve its policy outcome, we need to forge much closer links with wider Scottish biodiversity policy and action at the local and national scale. Scottish biodiversity strategy and the delivery plan include a whole suite of actions which need to ramp up now, and BE can be a critical source of funding for this. Given the scale of action required for nature restoration in Scotland, we need to ensure that enhancements are catalysing nature resilience and restoration actions with a landscape and catchment impact, and to ensure that they address existing strategic goals and local, regional, and national priorities. Again, echoing Steve's points. The crux of this, I guess, is that offsite enhancement will often present the best way to maximise biodiversity value, and these opportunities should be taken where this delivers more for nature. Understandably, the planning system works with a strong focus on the development site, the red line boundary, but for it to effectively contribute to nature restoration at scale, there is a need to coax it out into the wider landscape and engage with the wider landscape and what would be best for nature. And of course, some developments, linear ones, for example, it's not always possible to compensate fully to no net loss on site, in which case compensation would also have to occur off-site. I think you've gone to the next slide already, so I'll continue. So I guess if there's one thing to take, it would be good for you to take away from this presentation, it's a plea for a bit more nuance in the discussion of on-site and off-site. Off-site and locally appropriate from both an ecological and a social point of view can go hand in hand. A core part of the RSPB's mission is to facilitate access to nature, and we have a significant programme of urban work doing just that here in Scotland. So we are in no way arguing for enhancements to be pushed out to the middle of nowhere, just that the primary consideration when deciding on location and type of enhancement should be what will maximise biodiversity value within the local ecological context. And I'm by no means an expert on BNG, but there is a growing body of research that the English framework is favouring on-site gains that are fragmented, not properly integrated into the wider ecological context, not what the community wants, and often poorly managed and monitored. And for a lot of the really large-scale net zero developments currently going through the Scottish planning system, on-site just doesn't work practically for linear overhead lines, and enhancements directly underneath a turbine are not what the community wants and aren't the best for nature. We hope that once developed, nature networks will have a really important role to play in identifying with communities the most appropriate location for enhancement that supports restoration at scale. But we don't have to wait for that point to see that the current strong prescription for on-site will not lead to conservation that maximises outcomes for nature or for people. Next slide, please. So in terms of the planning cycle, it's pretty early days for the delivery of policy here on the ground. There's still a bit of a dearth of good examples to point to, both on-site and off-site. But it's also always helpful to point to something tangible, and RSPB Scotland has entered one agreement to deliver off-site enhancement for an overhead line within Loch Lomond and the Trossachs National Park. I'm hesitant to put it forward as a sort of exemplar of best practice biodiversity enhancement, as we were pretty hamstrung by Ofgem's requirement to derive BNG units. That's a whole different webinar topic that we can have another discussion another day. But I do think it neatly demonstrates why a singular focus on onsite is misguided. Obviously, an overhead line, it's a linear development. So from both a way leaves and an ecological point of view, onsite enhancement wasn't appropriate. As you can imagine, we have a pretty stringent internal process to ensure we aren't becoming associated with development that isn't properly adhering to the mitigation hierarchy. So we are getting compensation on site. We're just talking about that enhancement component. Our Inversnaid reserve on the eastern shore of Loch Lomond, a short distance from the development, hosts a mosaic of habitats spanning over 800 hectares and encompassing mature Atlantic wood, regenerating woodland, open moorland, upland grassland, and wetlands. If you're ever in the park, I'd recommend a visit. A key ecological objective of the reserve and the surrounding area is to enhance the extensive mosaic of upland habitats. These areas are a critical component of Inversnaid's landscape, and in addition to scarce moths such as the yellow-ringed carpet, the mosaic hosts important feeding areas for bird species such as black grouse and golden eagles. We've developed a project to restore an area of 218 hectares of upland habitat mosaic that sits above the 300-metre contour to the east of the reserve. The habitat restoration and enhancement plan details a strategy for herbivore management, increasing habitat quality, maximising opportunities for biodiversity, and linking these areas to the wider ecological context, including the Great Trossachs Forest National Nature Reserve and the park's future nature roadmap. So just to sum up, biodiversity enhancement represents a significant opportunity to reverse development's contribution to biodiversity fragmentation and decline, both for individual developments, but also cumulatively across Scotland. But the location of enhancements will be critical to ensuring this opportunity is maximised, and as long as the local ecological context is properly accounted for, offsite options should be routinely considered. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Johnny, so much, and to all our speakers. Now, for Q&A,